What's up, Psychedelic Spotlight? It's your boy James here again, bringing you another fantastic interview. This time we have the one and only Payton Nyquvest, who is CEO of Numinus. Thank you so much for doing this today, Payton.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well,
Fantastic. So why don't we hop right into it? What is the problem that you were trying to solve with the company of Numinus?
Yeah, we talk a lot about accessibility. There's obviously a lot of excitement around what role psychedelics play within the healthcare system and more broader wellness in general. A lot of interest in expanding the molecule set, expanding patents, IP, and if you look at the consistency, any deck in the space paints the picture of this massive addressable need.
Right.
And I think we need to stay focused on that. And so for the company, it's continuing to advance clinical research, but really, how do we make these treatments accessible for people? How do we make them successful? And how do we make sure that marginalized communities and people who are really in need are also getting access to the treatment as well?
So since we're talking about accessibility, let's zero in on a couple of key aspects of that. So the first one, I guess, would be scaling up the process. So let's assume that MDMA therapy for, say, PTSD, which you guys are working on with MAPS, let's assume it passes through phase 3 trials in a couple of years from now and you can actually start providing this care. How do you scale up the procedure so that anybody, let's say North America-wide, can receive the treatment?
It's a good question. So I think obviously continuing on with some of the research and validity around MDMA for PTSD, but also more broadly, how do you look at other indications and how do you get it into a real world setting? Those are some of the questions that we're continuing to work towards with MAPS in terms of scaling up the training of practitioners, the creating of physical infrastructure to be able to actually house MDMA-assisted psychotherapy.
So on the topic of infrastructure, you guys actually already have some clinics across Canada.
Correct.
Like you've got a few in Montreal, where I'm from. I believe you have a couple in Vancouver as well, and one other city that I'm blanking on, right?
Yeah, in Toronto.
Toronto,
Yeah.
And so in those clinics right now, you guys are mostly focusing on ketamine. However, again, assuming it passes through phase 3 trials, you guys are going to start providing MDMA therapy there too?
Correct. And all the locations have been built to be able to actually house MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as well.
Okay, so the therapists that are currently there, will they be able to, do they need to go under new training for, say, MDMA and then eventually psilocybin?
It's a good question. So MAPS, for example, to be able to do the MAPS protocol, you do need the MAPS training. And what we've also been looking at is how do we integrate experiential-based training, which is really important as well. So we have over 30 practitioners who have been trained in the MDMA protocol and are able to not only administer the clinical research, but obviously as research converts into practice, we have practitioners that can do that as well.
Okay, so let's focus on this MAPS partnership, because it's probably one of the most interesting aspects about Numinus, the fact that you've been able to partner with what's really the big boy in the space, like the original institution that's really been pushing the boundaries for decades and decades. So why don't you just walk us through how the partnership with MAPS actually works?
Yeah, so MAPS and I started speaking about 2.5 years ago, and also with our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Evan Wood, who ran a center called the British Columbia Center on Substance Use, and they were actually the sites for the phase 2 work that was done by MAPS, and then we've obviously been able to support on work going forward. Really, the opportunity with MAPS is a fewfold. For us to get comfortable with the clinical protocol with MDMA, to be able to host some of the sites, to be able to train the practitioners, and then as Numinus continues to grow and as MDMA becomes available, even on the lab side of things, to be able to have distribution licensing.
Okay.
MAPS is going to be a producer of the raw product of MDMA, and we could be one of the sites to be able to actually distribute the actual MDMA itself as well.
So do you, and if you can't answer this question,
Sure.
that's fine, but do you foresee your partnership with MAPS continuing to expand and maybe evolving into other areas?
Yes.
Yes, and we'll leave it at that, I guess. So that's fantastic. So let's maybe pivot slightly. So we've up until this point talked about MDMA for PTSD.
Sure.
Let's talk about psilocybin for addiction. Why is this something that's exciting?
I think you need to look at psilocybin in terms of some of the more broad indications, and I think psychedelics in general. What we've really looked at is whether it's addiction, suicide, PTSD, anxiety, depression. Most of these are just expressions of trauma, and the thing I think we continue to see psychedelics effective for so many different indications because they get at the root of trauma, which creates all of these different expressions in the first place. So obviously addiction continues to be a significant problem in our society. Rates continue to climb, and where we've seen pattern interruption is really helping cure the trauma that creates the addiction in the first place.
That's great. I've actually heard before, maybe it was from you in our last discussion, I'm not sure, but I've heard in the past that oftentimes we're misdiagnosing the symptoms for the disease.
Correct.
So when we're looking at addiction, addiction isn't the disease that needs to be treated, it's a symptom of the trauma that people may have experienced as a child or through some sort of sexual abuse or whatever you have, whatever have you. So do you think in the future we could maybe try to shift the because even like when you guys are working now, you're like in the official trials, you're working to treat addiction. Do you think we could see a greater like paradigm shift towards treating trauma instead?
That's exactly where we see psychedelic medicine fitting, and why we believe models built around accessibility, and more importantly, where does the psychedelic treatment fit within a person's healthcare path? You know, we talk about addiction, we talk about treatment-resistant depression. One of the reasons why people got so excited about psychedelics in the first place is it's alleviating this burden that we have on the healthcare system. Why are we placing psychedelic treatment at the end? If we're believing that we need to relieve the burden, really the work should be creating psychedelics as a standard of care. We've seen that psychedelics have curative intent. Why do we need to put them at the end of a person's care path? And that's where we really see the opportunity. Yes, there needs to be more research that continues around indication treatment, but we believe also more importantly, where does it fit as a standard of care? And I think some of the work around diagnosing, creating that care path for people is going to be really, really important.
Okay. So natural psilocybin versus synthetic psilocybin. I know that you guys are using natural psilocybin. You recently, I believe, began a clinical trial comparing and contrasting the two. Is that correct? Am I getting my details right?
Yeah, so we have a phase 1 that's launching with a psilocybin extraction.
Okay, yeah. So what are the perhaps negative, the downsides, the synthetic psilocybin that you hope to alleviate using natural psilocybin, or why choose natural psilocybin over synthetic psilocybin?
I think we're going to be in a place where there's it's not going to be one or the other. I think there's going to be choice. I think psilocybin will be fairly generic, especially on the synthetic side of things. Synthetic psilocybin is expensive at the moment. From what we've seen, natural psilocybin has the opportunity to be more cost effective than synthetic psilocybin would be. And the other thing that's really interesting, Mother Nature's been figuring out psilocybin for a very long time. And the things that we see in the natural psilocybin extraction is there's other compounds within psilocybin-containing fungi that have significant therapeutic benefit. So well-known things like melatonin, serotonin, baeocystin, all the way to previously undiscovered compounds as well. And most people who come to psychedelic work have been let down by a synthetic product, whether that's an SSRI, prescription medications. And so we do think there's going to be a strong market for natural product. And so for us to create a standardized natural product that fits the consistency requirements of the FDA and Health Canada is an important part of our commitment, again, towards accessibility.
Okay. So I found that it was really interesting that you talked about how there might be other components to, let's say, magic mushrooms that we haven't necessarily discovered yet.
Yeah.
Is that something that Numinus is working towards, is kind of mapping out the other chemical properties of natural fungi?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you look at the different bioactive pathways as well, and how do some of these other compounds affect those bioactive pathways, even creating more absorption and uptake, and all the way to, is there opportunities with these different compounds to create psilocybin products that may be more effective for certain situations or indications that somebody's struggling with?
Yeah, because like something that's little understood in the psychedelics world, unless you're an avid psychonaut using it, is that much like cannabis, psilocybin or magic mushrooms has different strains, and different strains can have different effects on people.
Absolutely.
So in the future, is that something that you could see Numinus doing, is like comparative trials of different strains of psilocybin mushrooms?
Yep, different strains, different compositions of extracted products, absolutely.
Fantastic. So I guess it's time for a personal question time. Have you ever experienced psychedelics?
Absolutely.
Which ones?
I have been through pretty much all of the psychedelic therapies. I really come.
So you took them in a therapy setting?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah. I come to this space as a patient. I'd suffered with severe chronic pain my whole life and went through the gamut of all of sort of the accessible Western healthcare modalities, and got myself to a point where I was getting hospitalized about 3-4 times a week and was really out of options, and ended up turning to psychedelics as really a last-ditch effort to try and save my own life. And that was really the catalyst for my healing path and ultimately why Numinus was formed in the first place.
So would you say then that your first experience was your most transformative?
People ask me like, what experience was the most transformative,
right.
or what's your favorite psychedelic? It sort of feels like asking, which kid is your favorite kid?
Fair enough, fair enough.
I think
most parents might secretly have an answer.
They all secretly have their answer. The first one for sure, it was so profound for me.
And this was psilocybin, your first one?
No, ayahuasca was actually my first
okay.
one. And to see, as I mentioned, suffering since birth with chronic pain issues, and I'm hesitant to call these a panacea. They're not.
Right.
There's still lots of work to be done, but 1 week with ayahuasca, and I went from someone who'd been chronically ill since birth to never having those chronic symptoms ever again.
That's honestly quite amazing, and obviously it's anecdotal. We can't extrapolate
Yep.
too much from it, but
Yep.
at a certain point when you're hearing thousands of these anecdotal stories, like we're here at the Wonderland conference right now, and it's person after person after person is talking about how they were dealing with issues very similar to yours, depression. Lots of people were talking about how they were suicidal.
Yep.
And then they stumble upon this medicine and their life has changed. And again, like you said, it's not a panacea. People still have to put in the work. They still have to want to make their lives better. But I get the feeling from listening to speakers here that we really are on the verge of something transformative, perhaps for our society as a whole.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So have you ever thought about what the effects on society as a whole would be if we were to liberalize our drug laws and more people were to experience this?
I think when we started, it was everybody has a grandiose, how do you save the world, right? The world's fine. It's people, that need help. And I think where we see these shifts, to talk about it on maybe a more micro level is why do we wait until we get sick? Why do we wait until we're really suffering? What about preventative mental health? We all go to the dentist. Even if we have good teeth, we go to the dentist. I think where psychedelics are really, really interesting, obviously, there's a huge amount of society that really, really needs help, and we need to treat those people.
Especially in this time and age.
Especially at this time and age. But as things progress, I think we can move towards what does mental wellness look like? What do these compounds mean in terms of creating a more connected and whole society? And I think that's why psychedelics, from our vantage point, there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of people chasing that excitement. But we look at this from from now, 20 years from now. I think this is a complete paradigm shift in healthcare, in mental wellness, and obviously, evolution and continuing consciousness advancement of human beings.
Do you think that, and I know this isn't exactly what Numinus is doing, but do you think that psychedelics might also have non-mental health benefits? Like I see that there's a range of companies now that are trying to use it to treat everything from like eye diseases to high blood pressure to heart issues. Do you think that it could there too?
Absolutely. I think, you look at the impacts of stress. You look at cancer, for example. You see people struggling with cancer, which is a physical diagnosis, and if you can alleviate the stress symptoms of cancer, can you make those diagnoses, calm down? One of the things we spoke about on the panel yesterday, our neurologist, Dr. Evan Lewis, who treats concussion patients. More than 50% of the participants he sees come in with a concussion trauma, but their symptoms get worse over time, and he could have, for example, 3 people. One person bumped their head on a table, one person slipped and fell on concrete, and one person got T-boned at 80 miles an hour. their symptoms are the same and they get worse over time. That's not how a physical trauma usually works. It's worse at the beginning and worse depending on the degree of severity, and it gets better over time. But people, their ego wraps around the diagnosis. They create self-fulfilling prophecies that make that physical expression worse and worse and worse. And you can't treat the trauma until you're able to release the actual ego and mental health side of things that end up actually alleviating and creating healing for that physical diagnosis. So we need to stop looking at people as like, here's your mental health, here's your physical health. You're all packaged up in one thing. And I think that's one of the things that healthcare is coming back centered around is whole human health.
So kind of on this topic, and maybe you might consider it a little bit, I don't know, woo-woo or whatever,
Sure.
but I'm curious to know your perspective on what exactly is happening when you're on a hardcore psychedelic trip, like let's say DMT or ayahuasca like you were on. Do you think that it's completely materialist, it's just chemicals in your brain doing their thing? Or do you think that there could be something greater at play, call it spiritual, call it whatever you want? Do you think that that's possible, or you think it's just neuroscience happening in the brain?
I think we're so limited in our understanding of how beings operate. You know, I think we're at such an interesting time to pull on your woo string for a minute. We have more people right now that identify as being some kind of spiritually oriented, and less people than since the inception of organized religion identify with a religion. So as a society, we recognize there's something bigger than ourselves that we're a part of, and we don't totally fall into the paradigms of organized religion before.
Do you think that the advent of psychedelic liberalization may create new religions?
I don't know if I think the understanding or experience of that connectedness, that connecting to something bigger than self, for sure. I think people probably look at religion and there's this longing to being connected to something bigger, you know, and we went through this period of, okay, our way to connect is we all have smartphones in our pockets. We're all connected on social media. We thought that was going to be our way to create connection, and it doesn't. It actually creates, makes sickness and creates isolation. But we're longing for that connection right now more than ever before. And COVID obviously threw gas on that fire to quite a degree. And I think we all recognize that. And I think, you know, but we're also in this really exciting time of opportunity where we can all connect way more than we ever have before. And if we can actually have that felt sense of connection, that encourages people to be more empathetic, to be more compassionate with one another, and to sort of see ourselves in everybody else and believe on, we all want to try and support each other and get each other through this.
If everybody had a little bit more empathy, the world would be a better place.
Right.
And I perhaps we should be wary of some sort of bias, but it seems like psychedelics do give people more empathy, and maybe we need that more stringently scientifically tested, but it certainly seems that way.
I think any help we can get helps.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do now, just to round it out, is my friend Brom, who works at Empath Ventures, gave me this deck here, and each card has a different question for interviewers. Some of them are pretty great. Some of them are like 2 paragraphs long, so if we draw that one, I'm just going to throw it out. We're not going to do that. But I'm going to channel my inner magician here.
Perfect.
Pick a card, any card. Perfect. I mean, we kind of covered this, but let's just give it one more time, hammer it down. How have psychedelics changed you?
Yeah, you know, as I mentioned, life-saving for me, and again, not a panacea, but really, you know, showing me that healing is really, really possible and deserved. And experiencing that on a very micro level in terms of myself, and on a macro level in terms of, as we said, there's the amount of anecdotal evidence of people who reach out, you know, expressing how much psychedelics have saved their lives. It is profound, and I think very, very exciting for the space moving forward.
Perfect. It's great to end on a note of hope. Payton, thank you so much for being with us today.
Likewise.